Hey, Richard Byers here. Hey, I hope you're like me. I go back and watch some of the videos I've done over the last couple of years, and I one of my most popular videos was on First Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. And of course, it deals with the whole idea of ecstatic utterances that was being practiced in the Corinthian church there in AD 60, AD 50, 50 and 60, right in that period of time. And and I believe that they were practicing ecstatic utterance, much like some groups do today. And it's not biblical tongues, but it's a common human phenomenon. It's a phenomenon where you give up your control of your faculties over to kind of a self-hypnotic state. You're not fully in control. And I pointed out how that it wasn't spiritual gifts that Paul was referring to in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 1, as all of your translations have. It should be now concerning, which, as you'll recall, if you don't know, go back and listen to those videos. Now concerning the spirituals, or pneumatica, and it was an elliptical figure of speech, so you had to add the object or the noun, and of course all of your translators dropped down to verse 4 and added gifts when I pointed out how they should stay in verses 1, 2, and 3 in the close context and put in their ecstatic utterances, not gifts, utterances or speech. And so now I was waiting for one of you maybe to catch a little bit of a problem that this brings up. And so nobody did, but that's okay. I'll bring it up myself because I say that's one of the videos that went viral for me. I had a lot of views, and so maybe you'll be interested in this. So we all know that 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 are all a unit. They're all covering. It's Paul's answer to the question that he gives the quick and short answer to in verse 12 or verse 1 of chapter 12, but he goes on then to explain the activity of the body and how the gift of tongues is to be expressed in the body and so forth. And then over in chapter 14, he then uses exactly this same word in exactly the same way. And the New American Standard, 1973 edition says, pursue love, yet desire earnestly ecstatic utterance. Now you have spiritual gifts, but it's ecstatic utterance. So he says, desire earnestly ecstatic utterance, but especially that you might prophesy. So here we have, in chapter 12, verse 1, we have Paul saying perhaps that when you practice ecstatic utterances, that Satan is using you in that altered state to curse Christ, to call Jesus accursed. But here in verse 1 of chapter 14, he says, go ahead and earnestly desire, and then he kind of contrasts it, but use this earnestly. So I'm going to step behind my screen right now and let you see the diagram of this sentence. The structure is the same, and I hope this is meaningful to you. So I'll come back in just a few minutes. Screen is a page from my notes in my work in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14. And I've covered chapter 12, of course, but what I wanted to bring to your attention is verse 1 of chapter 14. So I've diagrammed the Greek text, and then I've substituted English words for the Greek words so that you can understand the text. So if I were to translate this into English and then diagram it, it would diagram differently. So this is a diagram of the Greek text, but with English words put in place of the Greek words. And so what I wanted to bring to your attention is that in this verse, 1 Corinthians 14:1, we have the same word, pneumatica, in the same structure, in the same grammar, with the definite article and as the object of a preposition, or in this case, the object of a verb. So it's again in the elliptical figure of speech. Let me bring my cursor over, if I may. Right here is where we have it. And so, and here's the conflict that I wanted to point out and deal with and help you in case you haven't seen this. So it says, Paul says, earnestly desire the ecstatic utterance. And so there is the conjunction there, but eagerly desire that you may prophesy. And then he adds the modifier there, especially. In other words, he's contrasting. He said you should desire ecstatic utterance, but there's something greater, and that is prophecy. So I've translated this down. Now let me move my cursor down so you can see it. Here's my translation. Earnestly pursue love, he concludes, yet eagerly desire ecstatic utterance, but especially that you may prophesy. In my commentary, it seems that ecstatic utterances can be under the control of Satan, as in 1 Corinthians 12, 1-3, as Paul, and can be guided by the Holy Spirit, as one would prophesy. So I'm going to step out from behind my screen here, and we'll discuss it. So you see the problem here that we have in the same context, in the same basic subject area. We have Paul dealing with this ecstatic utterance, seemingly in two different emphases. And I admit the problem. And so here's my solution. So on the verse in 12:1, to me it's crystal clear. But in 14, I don't know what Paul is doing there. Is he being sarcastic? Is he? We have to take him seriously. We can't dismiss this as sarcasm or something. And so he is suggesting, it looks like here, that their practice of ecstatic utterances could be, and I emphasize that, could be an evidence of the Holy Spirit. But I think we need to take Paul's words in the chapter 12, verse 1, 2, and 3 extraordinarily seriously. This is dangerous territory. In my ministry, I've been involved in casting out demons, and it's nothing to mess with. This is a frightening and extraordinarily serious endeavor. And I've also studied hypnosis and realized that you can enter an altered state. And again, these things are very dangerous and not something to play around with, and not something to be involved in. But I want to conclude this video with this illustration. So in recent months, over the last couple of years, I guess it might be, I've studied Chuck Smith. Now, Chuck Smith was the founder of the Calvary Chapel. I guess you could call it a movement. There's, 1,000, 1,500 Calvary chapels across the nation. And Chuck Smith was kind of the founding father of that group. Now, Chuck Smith was a recent movie, by the way, The Jesus Revolution, with Greg Laurie and Lonnie Frisbee, and talking about some of the things that happened when the hippies began to accept Christ there in the early 70s. Now, Chuck Smith came out of Foursquare. Now, Foursquare is a Pentecostal denomination that involves itself in ecstatic utterances as a regular course. And so I was fascinated to see how this was handled, because you don't see that today in Calvary chapels to any extent. And so I was fascinated. But here's the story. Chuck Smith had, I think he was a man led by the Spirit of God. I don't think there's any question about that. He was mightily used over his lifetime. But early, one of the stories that I read, while he was in Bible school, and of course in the Foursquare context, a student got up in chapel and began to exercise ecstatic utterances, was in an altered state. And as a student, Chuck went up, grabbed the guy physically, and restrained him and stopped him. And so I thought, whoa, this is interesting. And so then later on in his ministry, or first 10 or 14 years, when he was essentially a Foursquare pastor, there was very little, apparently, as I read. I couldn't find any real evidence that ecstatic utterance had played any particular role in the fellowship. And then you get into Calvary Chapel, you don't see it hardly at all. And so I see it. So this is what I wanted to say in appreciation for what I've read about Chuck Smith. It looks like that he handled ecstatic utterances just as Paul would have you do in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14. Now, some of you were involved in my earlier days, and I was coming from the instruction with Dr. Earl Rodmacher, who also came out of Foursquare, and who was, I might say, violently against ecstatic utterance. And much of my work in the spiritual gift area, and particularly the gift of tongues, came from Dr. Rodmacher's classes. And so you will notice that I've moderated a little bit on this, and it's because of the Apostle Paul. You know, he says there in verse 14 exactly the same word, exactly the same structure, and he seems to be stepping back and then allowing that practice to occasionally occur. I have no idea. Here's my wisdom on the thing. I would avoid it like the plague. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't have now the scriptural backing to forbid it. And now tongues is another subject. That's another subject altogether. But this ecstatic utterance, again, it's very, very dangerous and fraught with all manner of difficulties to involve yourself where you're in an altered state. Having said that, there is a great desire, and I experience it myself, to have a touch of the Holy Spirit, a touch from God in your consciousness, and have even emotional experience. As I've gotten older, I almost can't control my emotions. God is so precious to me. And when I think about the sacrifice that he paid for my sin, it's hard for me to restrain myself emotionally. So I understand the emotional response to God, and certainly in worship and in the ministry of the word, we have emotional responses to God. And so I guess I'm not wanting to quench the Spirit, let's say it that way. And I guess I want to stand with the Apostle Paul and hope someday soon to do it actually. So anyway, thank you so much for your patience. Again, this is a more difficult passage, and I can't be as, if you will, forceful in saying this is what it says, do this, do that. Paul is a little bit obtuse, I think, in this passage. Hey, thank you for joining me. God bless you in the study of his word. Yeah, I just finished filming the video you just watched, and in my review of the video and editing, I noticed in every instance when I say ecstatic utterance, it should be plural, utterances, and I didn't make that clear, and even on my diagram I failed to write that as a plural, but it is plural, ecstatic utterances. So I just want to add that note of correction, and I hope you enjoy this video. Thank you.